I walked into the glass atrium of the Meridian Tower, knowing exactly what would happen. The woman who once stole my career was inside, surrounded by the people who worshipped her. In 2 hours, her empire would start to collapse, and she wouldn't even realize I was the one holding the match. If you've ever been betrayed by someone who smiled to your face while stabbing you in the back, you'll understand what comes next. Stick around, hit like if you believe in karma, and subscribe for more real revenge stories that prove justice doesn't always need a courtroom. I used to think loyalty mattered more than ambition. That was before I met Evelyn Hart, the kind of woman who could turn a compliment into a trap and make betrayal look like mentorship. Back then, I was just Clara Moreno, a junior data engineer at Hart Systems, a mid-sized tech firm in Chicago. Evelyn was the founder, brilliant, charismatic, and terrifyingly precise. She had a way of locking eyes that made you feel like you were both seen and dissected. She found me during a presentation I gave to a room full of investors, my first big one. I developed a predictive analytics algorithm for healthcare logistics, something that could save hospitals millions by forecasting patient needs before they arose. I still remember her hand on my shoulder afterward. "Clara," she said, smiling, "you just changed the future." For a while, I believed her. She became my mentor, my guide, even my friend. Late nights turned into strategy sessions. She'd pour a glass of wine and talk about how women like us had to be smarter, sharper, unflinching. "Don't wait for permission," she'd say. "Take your seat at the table, or build your own." I didn't realize she meant her table. 6 months later, she called me into her office. The walls were all glass, and her desk was a minimalist shrine, 2 screens, 1 orchid, no clutter. "Clara, the investors loved your project," she said, smiling like a wolf. "We're presenting it at the Global Health Tech Summit next month. But small detail, the board thinks it should be presented under the company's brand." "Of course," I said. "It's our project." She tilted her head. "Actually, it'll be presented under my name. Optics, you understand. Investors trust me. But you'll be on stage too, as technical support." Something inside me twisted. "Evelyn, I designed—" She cut me off gently, smiling. "Clara, darling, don't make this emotional. You'll get your credit internally. Trust me, this is how the game is played." The words tasted like poison. That night, I didn't sleep. My mind kept circling the same question. Why me? Why not build me up instead of taking what I made? The answer came at the summit, when Evelyn took the stage wearing that immaculate white suit and the microphone clipped just below her jawline. She introduced her revolutionary predictive algorithm, the one I built. My slides, my models, my code. I stood behind her, out of the camera's frame, a shadow in black, while she shone under the lights. When the crowd rose to its feet, applauding her visionary breakthrough, something broke quietly inside me. After the event, she handed me a glass of champagne. "We did it," she said, clinking her flute against mine. Her eyes dared me to say otherwise. 2 weeks later, I was fired. Officially, for breach of protocol. Unofficially, I knew what happened. She'd found my email draft to a patent attorney. I'd been naive enough to think I could file the algorithm under my name. Since I'd created it before joining the company, she'd gotten to them first, claimed intellectual property ownership, attached it to her company, and froze me out. HR escorted me out with a box of my things. Evelyn watched from her office window. I didn't look back. That night, I sat in my car outside my apartment for hours, staring at the steering wheel. My phone buzzed, an email from her. Just one line. "Next time, Clara, protect your ideas before you share them." It wasn't advice. It was victory. I spent the next year scraping by. Freelance contracts, startup gigs that didn't pay on time. Some nights ramen for dinner. But every failure added something Evelyn couldn't take. Resilience, precision, hunger. She'd stolen my work, but I still had my mind, and I had a plan. The day I decided to get even wasn't cinematic. I wasn't in a dark room surrounded by blueprints. I was sitting in a cramped coffee shop, scrolling through job postings, when I saw a headline pop up on my screen. Heart Systems signed $60 million contract for predictive health Al. My algorithm, her empire. But here's the thing about algorithms. They remember their creators. My signature was still embedded in the original codebase, a hidden marker in the metadata, invisible unless you knew where to look, and I did. That day, I stopped being Clara Moreno, the ex-employee. I became something else. Over the next 5 years, I built my own company from scratch, Auralis Tech. We started small, remote data solutions for regional hospitals, but within 3 years, we were competing head-to-head with Heart Systems. By year 5, we weren't competing anymore. We were winning. And that's when I got the invitation. The Global Health Tech Summit, Chicago. Keynote speaker, Evelyn Hart, CEO of Heart Systems. Special guest, Clara Moreno, CEO of Auralis Tech. Fate doesn't send emails often. When it does, you answer. And so, 11 years after Evelyn Hart stole my work and my name, I walked back into her world, not as the apprentice, not as the victim, as the storm. Walking back into that conference center felt like stepping into a museum exhibit of my own past humiliations. Glass cases filled with the trophies she'd polished while I learned to fix the lights. The atrium smelled of expensive coffee and citrus-scented hand sanitizer. People moved like currents, polite and precise, name badges catching the fluorescent glare. Evelyn was everywhere before she appeared. Her reputation preceded her like a perfume. I had rehearsed my calm on the drive over. I had calibrated every expression in the mirror that morning, until the lines around my mouth read steady, rather than scarred. But rehearsed calm is fragile. It cracks under the first human cue that matters. I saw her before the crowd did, the way she angled her head, the slow, practiced smile that softened only as far as it needed to. She wore charcoal, the color of someone who never needed to apologize. Around her, a circle of admirers orbited, investors, journalists, a few C-suite executives I'd either outmaneuvered or outperformed in the last fiscal year. She caught my eye, and for the first time in a decade, I felt naked. Not because I wanted to be seen, the opposite, but because she had always specialized in making people small, the prey who stayed visible, whom she could scoop up and hold like a specimen. "Clara," she said, voice smooth as glass, stepping forward with a hand raised in a welcome that was performative and precise. Her eyes flicked to my company lanyard and then back to my face. "I'm so glad you could join us. Thank you for the invitation," I said. My voice surprised me, low, controlled, the same tone I used in investor calls when I had to deliver bad news without making the board want to throw something. She hugged me, the kind of hug that says, "I own the moment." Her palm lingered at the small of my back, like a reminder that once she'd been allowed to do that without consequence. I accepted it, as a host accepts a handshake. The summit itself was a glinting show of power and ideas. Panels, booths, networking rooms with names carved into wooden placards. I did what I always do in rooms like that, scan the faces, read the patterns. Investors who laughed too loudly when Evelyn spoke. Engineers who kept their heads down but watched her hands. Security who wore earpieces and watched the exits with reverence. The first day passed in a haze of calls and polite conversation. I watched Elvin from a distance, like a scientist observing an animal in a controlled environment. She moved through the crowd like oil through water, smooth, unbroken, dissolving any obstacle. That afternoon, a theater panel on Help, Ethics in Owl and Healthcare drew a crowd. Evelyn was the keynote. The auditorium hummed before she stepped on stage. The spotlight seemed to find her, the way tides find the moon. When she began, the applause felt pre-scripted, the kind of warmth that reads like a contract. She spoke about innovation as stewardship, about protecting consumers and guarding trust. She used the word "we" a lot, as if Heart Systems single-handedly embodied industry conscience. I listened to her use my old models in examples, rebranding them with her company's logo that flashed behind her in glossy slides. The old reflex rose, the urge to stand and shout, to rewind time and claim what was mine. I didn't. I let her speak. After the panel, a young product manager came up to me with shaking hands. "Miss Marino, your work on predictive triage, it literally saved our pilot," she said. She held my gaze like she might steal something with it. "We want to partner. We need your tech integrated by Q4. Her gratitude was small and real. It cut through the performative fog of the summit like sunlight through dust. That night, a private dinner was hosted for speakers and top sponsors. The room was dark, candlelight painting soft halos on the tablecloth. Evelyn presided like a queen. She sat at the head, a silent orchestra conductor, while the rest of us fumbled through compliments and shared war stories. I sat 3 seats away. At one point, a senior partner from an international healthcare fund leaned toward Evelyn and asked about the algorithm Heart Systems had licensed last year. "Phenomenal work," he said. "Is it true you collaborated with a university team out of Boston?" Evelyn smiled, palms flat on the table. "We have an exceptional team," she said. "Our model is proprietary, but we did take academic guidance on ethics implementation." I felt something unfurl inside me, not anger, but the cold, clinical recognition of a lie. It wasn't new. Half her public life was stitched with selective truths. But the dinner air tasted suddenly metallic, and a memory rose. The night I drafted a letter to a patent attorney on the company laptop, while the two of us had been celebrating a milestone. A sloppy, hopeful draft, saved on a folder she'd later claim she never saw. I excused myself, needing air. The night was brittle and cold. Chicago's October wind slapped at my coat. I stood at the building's edge and called Maya, my COO, who had stayed behind to man the booth. "Everything okay?" she asked, and I heard the concern in her voice. "She's smooth," I said. "Don't let the velvet fool you." "We know," Maya replied. "We've got the investors coming by our booth tomorrow. Focus on that. Don't get dragged into anything." Her words steadied me like a hand on the back of a chair. I breathed in, cold and clean, and told her I would. But revenge is not a single moment of relish. It's 1,000 small calculations. The next morning I arrived early to the exhibition hall and planted myself near the Auralis booth, like a general inspecting troops. Our demo rigs hummed, monitors displaying slick visualizations of patient flows. People stopped, lanyards scanned, business cards were exchanged. 4 hospitals asked for pilots. The world felt finally proportional to the work I'd done. Around noon, an unexpected call came through. A reporter from a leading tech magazine wanted a quick quote about the ethics panel. He asked for an on-the-record statement about collaboration in the industry. I spoke candidly about transparency, about proper attribution, about integrity in IP management. The piece would publish the next week, he said. He sounded almost apologetic. "You're not the only one we'd like to interview," he said. "But your voice is sharp." That evening, I learned that the article's editor had also reached out to Evelyn. She declined, citing a schedule conflict. The editor asked if I might be willing to sit for a longer piece on leadership. I agreed. The momentum felt intoxicating, until the email arrived. A terse message from Heart Systems' legal team. They had noticed my public statements about attribution and intellectual property. Could I please avoid making unfounded accusations during the summit? It was a polite threat dressed up as concern for the industry. Threats are currency in certain rooms. I forwarded the email to Maya and our counsel, and then, against every nerve that wanted to play safe, sent a single line back to the Heart Systems lawyer. "I am speaking about transparency and industry best practice. If you have concerns, please address them to me directly. I have nothing to hide." No one had seen me like this in years. Not pleading, not begging, but measured, confident. It felt dangerous and honest all at once. That night, I didn't sleep again. The conference floor had shifted beneath me, subtle as tectonics. I saw the people who had supported Evelyn, a lattice of favors and quiet deals that had propped her for a decade. I saw my own path branching, slick with potential. The stakes were higher than I'd admitted to myself. This was no longer about a stolen algorithm. It was about the system that let one person erase another for applause. The next morning, as I stepped into the elevator, a woman with a Heart Systems badge slipped in beside me. She smiled a smile I knew well, the corporate smile, polished and empty. "Miss Hart sends her regards," she said, casual as a breeze. "She'll be at the awards tonight." Ooh. My chest tightened. Awards. Tonight, my calendar pinged with an invite. That evening, the summit would culminate in a gala where Heart Systems was expected to receive the Innovation in Healthcare Award. The auditorium would be full, cameras, donors, the very moment when a public narrative could be cemented. I had 3 choices then: the coward's retreat, the naive confrontation, or the surgical strike. I had spent years sharpening tools for the third, but preparation means patience, and patience is its own kind of revenge. I spent the afternoon building pressure. Auralis's demo ran flawlessly. An EVP from a hospital system signed a letter of intent. Investors nodded. One quietly asked about a strategic partnership. Each win was a brick in a wall I was rebuilding around my past. As twilight fell, the gala lights shimmered like a held breath. I stood in a back as the awards were about to be announced, fingers pressed to the program. Evelyn took the stage amid thunderous applause. Her acceptance speech was part humility, part manifesto. She thanked partners, researchers, the team. She mentioned collaboration several times, painting the firm's success as a communal triumph. When the applause died down, she did something I hadn't seen before. She turned her head and offered a brief, pointed nod in my direction. For a breath, the room contracted. I felt every eye like a needle. 100 mobile flashes popped like distant fireflies. I wanted to leave. I wanted, unbelievably, to step onto that stage and dismantle her with facts and code and the quiet brutality of truth. But I stayed. Because revenge that feels like vindication must be deliberate, not cathartic. As she descended the stage, a woman from a major foundation approached with a congratulatory handshake. Evelyn smiled and accepted a small, discreet envelope. The kind that contains endorsements, invitations, influence. I watched as she slipped the envelope into her clutch, her fingers brushing the leather like a benediction. In that moment, a line I had rehearsed for years solidified in my mind. She was not going to be stopped by sentiment or scandal. Stopping her'd require something she couldn't buy. And I had time and patience and a network that was growing by the hour. I left the gala that night with a list in my head: names, schedules, access points, weak links I'd spotted over the last 2 days. Each name was a chess piece, each schedule an opening. The plan was forming not as a fever dream but as a method. Small exposures, public pressure, legal leverage, and the one thing she had never fully accounted for, the people her lies had hurt. I walked into the cold night and didn't look back. The summit had given me more than a platform. It had given me the map. And maps are for those who know how to read them. When you decide to take back what was stolen, the first thing you learn is how small decisions matter. Not the cinematic gestures, no exploding servers or dramatic boardroom confessions, but the tiny, surgical choices: which email to save, which handshake to return, which smile to keep neutral. Revenge, I discovered, is a craft. It requires rehearsal, humility, and a ledger of slights you intend to balance. I started with the obvious paperwork. For years, Heart Systems had relied on a tangle of contracts, off-books agreements, and feints that only looked clean if no one dared to press. I hired a discreet forensic accountant named Omar, an ex-auditor whose hands smelled faintly of coffee and old books. He had a way of smiling at numbers the way other people smiled at puppies, tender and a little insane. I gave him access to everything I could. Archived patents, the metadata markers tucked into ancient code, invoices with missing lines, contract addendums stamped with hand dates. He spent a week in my office, eyes going glassy in the way only people who love detail do. When he looked up and said, "There's a trail," my chest unclenched. Next came people. Revenge that succeeds is rarely solitary. There are always allies, people who remember being ignored, dismissed, or flattened under the same boots. I reached out to nurses, hospital administrators, and mid-level engineers who'd worked on projects Heart Systems had led. I met a retired clinic manager named Gloria in a diner at 7 a.m., where the coffee was cheap and the chairs wobbly. She trembled when she told me about billing codes switched in her name, about elderly patients billed for services that never happened. Her eyes found mine and shone wet with a mixture of fear and relief. "I thought it was me," she said. "I thought I'd lost my mind." Now she sat across from me with a bulging folder of cancelled checks and appointment logs. "I'm tired of the shame," she said. "If you can show the truth, I'll speak." People lend you truth when they recognize the courage to speak it. I mapped their stories onto the ledger Omar had built. Names overlapped. Patterns repeated. A friendly vendor who showed up to the clinic with supplies that never made it into inventory. A billing specialist who suddenly left with a golden handshake after questioning a code. A set of emails where Evelyn redirected a grant to a shell entity and thanked the sender for their table. Discretion. The more we connected, the clearer the image became. This was not just greed. It was an architecture of deceit, polished to look like competence. But facts alone do not topple reputations. Spectacle does. I needed a public narrative that would be hard to ignore, but harder to falsely dismiss. We built a 3-phase plan: expose the bookkeeping inconsistencies, amplify human stories of harm, then apply legal pressure that forced Heart Systems into public reckonings. Each stage had to dovetail with the next, so they couldn't simply sweep one away. Phase 1, the drip. I leaked a tightly worded dossier, verified excerpts of invoices, redacted details of patient complaints, and a timeline under embargo to 2 journalists I trusted. I didn't want scandalous headlines. I wanted curiosity from reputable outlets that valued nuance. One reporter, Annika, had a reputation for patience and precision. She called me in the middle of the night after reading the file. Her voice was a mixture of professional excitement and human anger. "This is the kind of pattern regulators love," she said. "Do you want us to run it as an investigative piece?" I asked for 3 things: corroboration from victims, access to internal documents, and anonymity for those who feared retaliation. She agreed. Phase 2, witnesses. We organized protected interviews. Gloria, the clinic manager, agreed to meet Annika in a conference room with a legal aid present. A former coder from Heart Systems, a kid named Terrence who'd been paid hush money, came forward with screenshots of commit logs, lines of code that bore my old signature markers, committed months before Heart Systems. Official launch. He'd been terrified, he said, and he'd needed time. Time had a way of building courage, as did seeing someone else choose not to stay small. Phase 3. The legal nudge. Omar and I forwarded a sealed packet to the state investigators, redacted financial irregularities, witness affidavits, and a polite letter requesting a preliminary review. We did not file for media fanfare. We wanted the wheels of enforcement to begin turning before the public narrative fully caught fire. Regulators move slowly, but when they move, they do so with a kind of quiet authority that can unpick empires. Throughout this, my nights were uneven. I'd fall asleep on the couch with my laptop asleep on my chest, wake at 2 a.m. and lie there tasting the metallic tang of adrenaline. Sometimes doubt visited like a cold friend. I'd picture Evelyn the way she watched me in that glass office years ago, and wonder if I'd become what I hated in trying to defeat her. Was I letting anger dictate every move? Was vindication worth the ripple effects on people who hadn't hurt me? These questions didn't stop me. They instructed me. I set boundaries. No information we provided was false. No witness was coerced. Our entries were facts layered with human consequence. They were close calls. One week, just as Annika prepared to run her piece, a lawyer from a national firm called and asked if I'd be willing to speak to a bar association probe about unethical journalism. The legal team from Heart Systems was trying to build doubt by attacking process. I met with our counsel and mapped a response. Tighten source protections, document every outreach, and prepare a counter-release with additional corroboration. I slept 6 hours that night, my phone resting like a hot coal under my pillow. Another near disaster came when Terrence's parents received a threatening voicemail referencing his former employer. They panicked and wanted to withdraw. My chest felt like ice. I could have pushed him to stay quiet. Instead, I helped him secure legal counsel and a temporary relocation. He agreed to continue, but with a lawyer present for every interaction. That moment, when a human cost stepped forward, taught me to slow down. Revenge can feel delicious, but it must be tempered with responsibility. This wasn't personal warfare for entertainment, it was about truth, and truth deserved dignity. We played the drip. Small stories hit reputable outlets. A cancelled appointment misbilled, a vendor paid for equipment that never arrived, a patient billed for a procedure they never received. Readers clicked, regulators took notes. Investors started calling Heart Systems with concerns. Their stock wavered, a micro tremor on financial news tickers. I watched the numbers like a weather pattern, expecting storms but grateful for the warning signs. And through it all, Evelyn looped like a satellite in my consciousness. She was not idle. I could see her reactive pathways when we'd catch the occasional glimpse of her moves. Press releases reframing errors as administrative anomalies, offers of compensation to a few complainants to quiet them, public statements about cooperation with inquiries. Each defensive maneuver told us she felt pressure. Good. Pressure reveals fracture lines. But people are messy instruments, and my plan relied on them. So I subverted risk with redundancy. If a witness backed out, we had another. If a document was questioned, Omar had a metadata trail proving origin. If regulators stalled, Annika's long-form piece would land and shape public sentiment, making it harder for a corporate PR team to bulldoze the truth. The most intoxicating part of planning was the moral arithmetic. I replayed the nights they told me I was irresponsible, the mornings my tuition had mysteriously disappeared, the closed doors and the quiet tutting in rooms I'd once hoped to enter. Those memories gave the plan texture. They justified the relentless patience. They made cold strategy feel like an act of restitution. Then the small thing happened that made me realize revenge had become real. At a partners meeting I attended in late November, an independent hospital admin slid a folded note across the table. Inside was a list of other clinics that had quietly dropped Heart Systems contracts in the past quarter, not because of technology, but because of trust erosion. The list was short but clean, no speculation, only terminated agreements and severed lines. They'd been waiting to see how things played, but this was the moment on the tower. The sun, the words, and the row of the chain was taken over. The final piece of the puzzle, the one that would convert suspicion into undeniable consequence, was legal testimony. I resisted it for a long time. Testifying meant reopening old wounds in public. It meant reading my history aloud where lawyers could twist words and opponents could weaponize sorrow. But testimony was the hammer that could drive the spike. So I prepared. I rehearsed my statements for hours with a former prosecutor who loved rhythm and the exacting cadence of truth. Speak slow, he said. Let the facts breathe. Fill each pause with the image you want them to hold. We practiced answering leading questions without lashing. We filed motions, signed affidavits, and made sure every T was crossed. And then, as winter crept in and the air held the sharpness of consequence, the call I'd been waiting for came. The investigators wanted to set a date for preliminary interviews. It was an odd mixture of fear and triumph. My hands trembled as I hung up the phone. The dossier that had lived on my drive, the hours Omar spent illuminating the finances, the whispering courage of Gloria and Terence, all of it converged toward a room where facts would be spoken under oath. On the walk home that night, the city lights blurred into a river of gold. I remembered being 23, carrying a suitcase in the rain, convinced that the world had closed. I also remembered the tiny contract I had kept from that time, a crumpled note from Evelyn promising mentorship, a handwritten apology after a minor mistake. I kept it in a drawer, as a reminder that people reveal themselves in what they promise and what they keep. There's a moment before a storm where the air holds, that quiet, charged second, when everything you've done coalesces into the possibility of consequence, is addictive. You feel every cell in your body humming with intent. I stood on that threshold. I had built the map, gathered the witnesses, primed the press, and nudged the legal machinery awake. The only thing left was the final move, the public unraveling. It would be a sequence of revelations threaded through testimony, regulatory findings, and human stories that could not be neatly spun away. It would require nerves of steel and an acceptance that my life would be pulled into public glare. I slept a cautious sleep that night, my mind rehearsing the cadence the prosecutor had liked. When the alarm went off at dawn, I felt a curious calm. The plan had left me. Now the plan would do its work. I poured myself a black coffee and typed a single sentence into a new document. Tell the truth. Let it be enough. Then I closed the laptop and walked out into the day that would change everything. The conference room where truth finally met consequence was smaller than I expected. No grand courtroom, no gavel. Just 4 people from the state investigator's office, a stenographer, a pot of stale coffee, and a hum of fluorescent lights that seemed too bright for the things we were about to say. I took my seat at the end of the long table. My hands were steady, though my throat felt like it had been lined with sandpaper. Across from me sat the lead investigator, a woman named Lillian Chen, sharp, calm, no nonsense. She greeted me with a polite nod, then pressed record on the device in front of her. "Miss Moreno," she said, "thank you for coming. You understand this interview is being recorded under oath?" "Yes," I replied. "Good. Let's start with your employment history at Heart Systems." And just like that, the ghosts walked in. I told them everything, how I built the original predictive algorithm, how Evelyn Hart had presented it as her own, how I'd been terminated after attempting to patent my work. I described the metadata signature buried in the code, the billing irregularities, the shell grants, the internal memos Omar uncovered. I kept my tone even, clinical. I'd practiced for weeks not to let my voice shake. But the moment that caught everyone's breath was when I pulled out the oldest proof of all, the raw data file from 11 years ago, time-stamped and watermarked under my name. Evelyn had stolen the public face of the algorithm, but she'd forgotten that the foundation lived in the logs. And those logs never lied. When the interview ended, Lillian shut off the recorder and gave me a long, quiet look. "We'll need to verify this," she said. "But if what you've provided checks out, this will move to formal investigation." I nodded, numb. That's all I want. I walked out into the cold December morning and stood on the steps for a long time, letting the wind slap colour back into my face. The city sounded different, clear, like static had finally lifted. For the first time in years, I felt still. 2 weeks later, the first domino fell. Annika's article dropped on a Thursday morning, Inside the Algorithm, How Heart Systems Built an Empire on Stolen Code and Silent Patience. It was brutal, precise, beautifully sourced. She tied every thread together, the code, the billing, the witnesses. She hadn't named me as her source, but it didn't take a genius to connect the dots. Within hours, my inbox flooded. Reporters, regulators, hospital boards. By noon, Heart Systems had issued a public statement denying all unfounded allegations. Evelyn called the accusations a coordinated smear campaign by competitors. Her photo accompanied every headline, immaculate as ever, jaws set, defiant. But then came the emails. First from former employees who had kept quiet out of fear, and from vendors who had been strong-armed into false invoices. Then from patients' families who recognized their parents' names in the redacted billing statements. The denials collapsed under the weight of human truth. Within 48 hours, the state opened a formal inquiry into Heart System's finances. Subpoenas were issued, accounts frozen. The company's share price plummeted 43% in a single day. Investors fled like rats from a burning shed. I watched it all from the 38th floor of Auralis headquarters. I didn't feel triumphant, not exactly. More like hollow and cleansed at the same time. Like I'd been holding my breath for a decade and finally exhaled. 2 weeks later, Evelyn called. I saw her name flash on my phone and, for a heartbeat, considered ignoring it. But some parts of closure you have to face head on. I answered. Clara, she said, her voice flat. None of the honey, none of the carefully managed warmth. I assume you're proud of yourself. I didn't reply. You could have come to me, she continued. We could have handled this privately. Handled, I repeated. You mean buried? She sighed, and for the first time, I heard something unfamiliar in her. Exhaustion. You think this makes you righteous? You've destroyed hundreds of jobs, families. My company was bigger than you, Clara. Bigger than your ego. I almost laughed. It was never about size, Evelyn. It was about honesty. Something you traded for applause. Silence. Then, softly, you always were sentimental. Click, she hung up. I stared at the phone, a strange pity blooming in my chest. For years I'd imagined this conversation ending with triumph, me calm, her broken. Instead, all I felt was the quiet knowledge that she'd built a cage out of lies, and it was finally closing around her. By January, the investigation findings were public. The report ran 247 pages. Fraud, misappropriation of grants, falsified billing, tax evasion, and the smallest but sharpest line, misattribution of intellectual property. Heart Systems was dismantled piece by piece. Evelyn resigned for personal reasons but couldn't stop the legal proceedings that followed. Her board cut ties. The company's name became shorthand for betrayal in every corporate ethics seminar that year. And me, I stayed silent. No interviews, no public statements. I let the facts speak. But the world never stays quiet for long. At a medical tech conference in Boston 3 months later, a young engineer cornered me after my keynote. You're Clara Moreno, right? From Auralis. I nodded. She hesitated, eyes bright. My mum was one of the patients billed by Heart Systems for a procedure she never got. I just wanted to say, thank you. Her voice cracked on that last word. She turned and disappeared into the crowd before I could respond. That was the first time I cried in years. Not from sadness, not even from relief, but because, for once, the truth had reached someone it was supposed to help. 6 months later, Auralis closed a massive deal with the World Health Consortium. We were expanding into Europe. Investors called it a new era of ethical healthcare tech. The irony was, certified letter, he said, his tone neutral. From her, Evelyn. Inside was a single handwritten page. Clara, I'm not asking for forgiveness. You did what I couldn't. You told the truth. Maybe you always had the stomach for integrity. I built an empire out of fear. You built one out of pain. Either way, we both built something that lasted. From E, I read it twice, folded it neatly, and slipped it into my desk drawer next to that old mental shit note from years ago. The one where she'd once written, I will take a deep picture of the horror of the children. And thanks, take your seat at the table or build your own. I whispered to the empty room. I built mine. A year later, Evelyn Hart was indicted on multiple counts of fraud. She took a plea deal, avoiding prison in exchange for restitution and permanent industry banishment. When the news broke, I didn't feel the need to gloat. Revenge had already done its work long before the sentencing. One afternoon, I drove out to Lake Michigan and stood by the water, coat collar turned up against the wind. The lake was frozen in sheets, broken by ripples of dark water glinting like metal. I thought about that younger version of me, the girl standing in the rain outside Heart Systems, humiliated, terrified, forgotten. I imagined her standing beside me now. If she could see what we'd built, maybe she'd finally stop shaking. Look, I said quietly, to no one and everyone. We made it. Revenge doesn't heal you. It doesn't give back the years. What it does, if you do it right, is return balance. It teaches you that silence isn't peace and speaking isn't always violence. Sometimes, truth is the only clean thing left after everything else rots. Heart Systems no longer exists. Evelyn Hart no longer commands rooms. But her lessons remain, not the ones she meant to teach, but the ones I took. Document everything. Build quietly. Trust sparingly. And when the world tells you to shrink, expand instead. Because the sweetest revenge isn't destruction, it's evolution. And I evolved. If you've ever been underestimated, lied to, or pushed aside, remember this. The truth always waits for its moment. It never rots. If you believe in poetic justice, hit like, share this story, and subscribe for more real tales of karma, redemption, and the strength to rise after ruin.